Welcome to Navigating Education, the podcast. The podcast that can help educators from around the world navigate not only the present, but also the future. Through discussions of instruction, EdTech, policy, and school leadership, we're here to connect with you and educators from around the world to help them amplify student learning for the betterment of our students and their future. Alrighty, welcome to Navigating Education, the podcast. I'm Dr. Matt Rhodes, your host, and I cannot believe we are at episode 49 of the podcast, and this is about, I think, our 14th episode of season 2. So I'm really excited to get close to 50, and it's always just fun just going through these episodes, learning, connecting, and then hopefully those that are listening can pick up a thing or two that they can really enjoy to help them navigate their current situation as well as the future. And I am really excited today to be talking about this idea of gratitude. And I think that we all have thought about gratitude ever since we've been growing up and been practicing it at different levels. And I think that it's something, there's a huge spectrum to it in terms of what you're doing. And also thinking about it in terms of education is, in my experience, has any teachers or administrators throughout my career as a student talked to me about having like gratitude? I can't even really count more than maybe 10 times on my fingers of how much we've been actually talking about this in the education space. Personally, I've heard about it in a lot of different spaces, but not too much in school. So I'm here to talk about evolving with gratitude with Lainie Rowell, and I'm excited to introduce her and talk a little bit more about this. So maybe we can get some more gratitude into our schools and districts, as well as maybe personally we can build our own gratitude practice. So thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm so excited. Been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
Definitely. So before we jump into talking about gratitude and evolving with gratitude, can you talk a little about yourself? I mean, you have done a lot in your career, from working at the district level, a TEDx speaker, you're an author ×2 now. You've done quite a bit. Talking pre-show with you have a lot of different lenses that you're looking at in education. So I always like the guests to talk a little bit about their background, maybe a little bit beyond just kind of what I talked about. So tell us your background and tell us, how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I won't start with like I was born on a cold, windy, rainy night or anything like that. But I will say I actually was not intending to go into education by any stretch of the imagination. I was actually a psychology major. And it was through my, you have to do some work hours. It's been so long. I'm getting up there in ages. I don't remember exactly what the phrase for it was, but you do community service hours basically as part of your field study. And I did it in a school. And I loved working with kids. I was like, okay, this is what I meant to be. Like, change lanes without signaling. It was really crazy for my parents. They're like, wait, we had to bribe you with a car to get you to do any schoolwork. You were, I was an athlete. I was not really a good student in the sense of like, I was compliant enough, but I really didn't value school enough. I definitely wasn't grateful for school. I will say that. So we can get into being grateful for learning in a bit. But so I just decided I actually wanted to go into education to do special education. That was 100% my focus. And I was on that path, and a family friend said, why don't you go into general education first and figure some things out, and then you can go into special education. And so I took that advice, and actually what happened was I got really interested in how technology could help learners with all sorts of, variability. We all have variability. So I really just fell in love with how technology can meet the needs of a very diverse group of learners. And so I kind of went into this ed tech world. And from there, there's just been, evolving is a big word for me. It's in the title of both of my books. And so it's just been kind of a constant evolution sometimes people are like, well, how did you go from, being in the classroom to being a teacher leader and a coach, and to then being at the district level, and now the work that I do, which is quite varied. I often say I'm not very good at saying no. And so when people would ask me to do things, I would be like, I can try that. And stepping out of my comfort zone was a real big deal. That's what got me into a lot of positions where I got to really stretch myself and grow. So
no, that's really interesting. Just, I feel like you and I have some similarities there. For example, my teaching experience was in special education, although I kind of went into it because they told me that you probably should get a special education and general ed credential when you started, because the job market at the time wasn't too hot. So it was really interesting that, sometimes, it's probably maybe the time that you got in, they're like, oh, you can go and dabble with a few things and figure things out. And I just recall just when I went in, it was just like super competitive. And it's like, if you had a single subject, just one single subject, if it wasn't math or science, good luck getting in, especially into a market like San Diego, or could argue Orange County as well, a difficult market. So that's really cool. So you got to dabble with things, and then you really got to try a bunch of different things early on, it sounds like, and then that kind of catapulted to all these different places for you.
Yeah. And I think for me, like, if I was to say what, if someone's like, well, what's the through line for all these things that you've done? It's always been building community and meeting the needs of all learners. Like, those are my big things. So, like I said, I was a psychology major. When I was in the classroom, I was always focused on how can I create a positive classroom climate? How can I see the best in all of my learners? How can I meet the needs of everyone? Those were always the things that were really top of mind. Again, that's why I leaned into technology. I saw that meeting the needs of a lot of kids who I felt like were not being served properly with traditional methods. And so that's kind of what leads me to everything that I do today, is how can we build that community, cultivate that sense of belonging, and meet the needs of our learners.
And speaking of psychology, I feel like gratitude, it's all about psychology, right? Because there's a lot of science behind it of, generally, this is me generally speaking, I'm not citing anyone right now, but the more gracious you are, the more maybe you practice gratitude, maybe that has a positive relationship with being happy or a higher level of well-being, possibly, give or take. But before I ask you really this question, did you talk about gratitude very much in your early career, or at all, as an educator growing into the profession?
Never explicitly. If I look back, I want to thank my parents for being great gratitude mentors. And so they really, I think, helped me, which I'm still on we want to have a grateful disposition, and I think I can always get better at that. But I really believe my parents gave me a nice foundation for not just having, simple reciprocity or feeling grateful, but actually being a grateful person. I feel like that was always there, but it wasn't explicit, and I was never articulating it. I was maybe in my actions doing it in my classroom with my learners, but I wasn't explicitly calling out gratitude in the way that I am now, for sure.
Yeah. I just think about it, like a lot of learners, especially, is that what these practices look like. Unless they're modeled by a family member or a friend or a mentor or a teacher or anyone in that space, sometimes you don't know what that looks like. So I think that where the movement that we're going towards, I feel like there's more opportunity to talk about this with social emotional learning as part of a huge part of the curriculum. But we'll talk about that in a bit. So what made you want to talk about this? What was like the aha moment? Hey, I want to write about this. I want to share my message about this. And I really want to start seeing this.
So I can tell you that, and Matt, I don't know if I've told you this before, but maybe we've talked about this. My first book that I wrote with Christy Andre and Lauren Steinman, Evolving Learner, came out March 13th of 2020. I'm not kidding. That was the exact day that the book landed at my doorstep. That's the day. Amazon says March 20. Amazon says March 24th. It is not March 24th. It came earlier. It was March 13th, which for most people resonates as the day that the world shut down. And so gratitude was not how I was feeling. I was feeling really, really frustrated because this is something that I had spent years working on, and there was so much buildup and I was so excited about it. And then to have this horrible, terrible thing happen in the world. And then I would feel guilty that I was bummed about the book because there's like more important things happening in the world. It's like people are getting sick. It was a tragedy. So gratitude was not how I was feeling. But then March 16th of 2020, so a few days later, Laura Kelly Finucci, I hope I say her name correctly, she posted a poem on Instagram, and it's about, when this is over. And I don't feel like I ever do the poem justice, but it's out there if you Google "When This Is Over," Laura Kelly Finucci. And she just line by line so beautifully talks about like the things that we won't take for granted in the future. A handshake with a stranger, full shelves on in the stores and things like that. And it was just kind of this aha moment of like, okay, I need to really be more present to what I'm getting now. And then also, once we're out of this, be more grateful for the things that we'll get to return to. So I started thinking about how grateful I was that, my kids were home safe with me. My husband was home safe with me. And there were all these things that I still really had that I could be grateful for. And our health is something that you didn't really think about being grateful for your health pre-COVID. Now it's something we're a lot more aware of and intentional with. So that was kind of something that was just for me personally, something that was happening. And I hadn't quite yet made the connection to bringing it into my practice as an educator. It was just something kind of I was doing personally. And in fact, I actually started giving people gratitude jars in the neighborhood. Like, I'm going to drop something on your doorstep. You can wipe it down if you need to, but I just want you to have this because this has been helping me and my family. And I had people reaching out saying, oh my gosh, this has like really changed us. And I'm like, okay, good. This is interesting. It's made a big difference for me. It's made a big difference for other people. And then about a year later, George Couros invites me to be a contributor in Because of a Teacher. And for people who aren't familiar with that book, there's George, it's his book. And then he has, 15 contributors. And we all write about either, a teacher or a principal or, something thinking back to our first year as a teacher. And I wrote about a principal who really put me on a leadership path. And I was just it was just this beautiful public expression of gratitude that it was the most joyful thing I'd ever written. And even when the book came out and I was like giving people copies of the book, and Steph Rothstein, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she was like, it was kind of a joke in a text, but I was like, oh my gosh, isn't this so beautiful? Look at this. And she's like, Lainie, I think you could write a whole book about gratitude Because of a Teacher. And I'm like, ooh, that's interesting. And so that's kind of when I was like, I'm going to take a look at gratitude in the context of learning and education. I wrote an article for Edutopia. People were reaching out like, oh my gosh, gratitude is everything. And I'm like, wow, like this is like, for people who seem to really appreciate gratitude, this is life-changing. I have more to learn about this. And for me, one of the best ways to learn is to write a book about something. So I set out on writing the book.
No, that's awesome. I recall your article back in like a year, like over a year and maybe a year and a half ago, the one from Edutopia. I remember reading it. I was like, this is a really good Edutopia article talking about this. And I think during the time period in California, at least, I think that a lot of schools were still online. I feel like there's a lot of still disruption going on because of the pandemic. And I was like, yeah, this is really good. And so it prompted you, gave you the aha moment to really jump in and start, further researching this and talking about it. So I want to talk a little bit more about, the research that you've done. And then I want to think about like the practices from the book and researching it, incorporating it into your own like practice first as an educator, but also personally. So you already had some practices going in, but what does it look like now for you?
Well, it's really interesting. So Dr. Robert Emmons is, I would argue, the world's leading science of gratitude expert. And so he's been studying gratitude for 25 years. And what's always funny is when you ask him, what's his gratitude practice, he's like, I don't really have a gratitude practice, because over the years, he has just developed a grateful disposition. This is just part of who he is. So he doesn't necessarily do like a gratitude journal every day or anything like that. I do have a practice that I do with my family every evening where we talk about what we're grateful for. That's just what works for me. But it was just really interesting to hear that someone who's been studying it for 25 years, it's like, well, you might get to a point where you actually don't necessarily need to do this habit every single day. But there's some people who want to. And I know some people, and we have people in the book talk about this, who they wake up and journal every single day and for years. And you count on one hand how many times. Oprah Winfrey, probably the celebrity that's the most outspoken about gratitude, for probably going on a couple decades, she's been doing a gratitude journal and says it's the best thing she ever done in her life. That's a pretty big statement from someone who has done a lot of work on self-improvement and living your best life, right? So, but one of the things that I really wanted to focus in on with the book is that a gratitude journal is not the only practice out there. And in fact, it's not the right practice for every single person. And some people might want to mix it up and have some variety. So I was very intentional in the book in providing a variety of practices. And then on top of that, there's also these 20 educators, there's 18 different stories, and they're talking about what gratitude looks like in their life. What is their practice and what is their impact? So I really want to be super clear that there is no one way to practice gratitude, and we can all find practices that work for us and take other people's practices and adapt them. And it's just so personal because we're all so unique and dynamic.
No, I think there's a lot of intersectionality to it, and there's a lot of just like personalized pieces to it. And I think that really can help, I think, in education setting. We'll talk about that in a minute. Oh, and there's a number of comments coming in. Steph Ronstein says, love hearing your journey, Lainie. She's in the comments. And then Bonds Mendoza from Maya Tech Life. He said, like, love the content, Lainie. He says, too great on a screen. So thanks so much for joining in and chatting with us over this. So, I mean, I think when I'm talking about gratitude, I feel like maybe a couple of the practices that I did in my classroom at one point, I was doing a restorative circle. We were doing a check-in, and I asked my students, I modeled, I don't know what the circumstance was, but I was like, I'm grateful for XYZ today.
Yep.
And we started doing it and went around the circle, building community. I think for me, that was probably one of the only times I have like expressed in practice gratitude in a classroom setting. But when I'm thinking about your work and thinking about like, how can we take the research and take this something that can be super personal and integrate it into the classroom setting in a safe way. First, how do you think we can go about sharing these practices with students, and how can it then help our teachers and students?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so much to say here. I just, one of the things that, and Steph, I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy everyone in the chat's here. But Steph is like definitely one of my gratitude mentors. And I love how in her story, she's talking about gratitude with the world, and we can talk about that later. But in the book, I talk about gratitude with kids, with peers, and with the world. So when we're talking about gratitude with kids, the first thing that I think we have to talk about is to be grateful for kids. Before we try and make kids grateful, let's first start off by being grateful for our kids, right? I think that's maybe seems like an obvious thing, but I think it's actually really important that we hone in on that. So one of the things that I do, which is pulling from my psych years or my psych degree, was when I learned about the praise to correction ratio. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but yes, it's a big deal. Behavior change. If you want to actually change a behavior, you need to catch it being done correctly 5 times to every 1 time you correct. And the ratio is different. Some people would say 7-1, 6-1, something like that. But it's like when we're trying to, I think our tendency, and maybe our negativity bias plays into this, but our tendency is to correct, and we don't remember to praise. And so we need to be grateful for all the things that our kids are doing correctly. In the book, I bring in some of the character traits that we can be grateful to kids for, because maybe they're struggling academically and it's a little tougher to find some of the things to compliment for there. I still would argue there are ways to do it, but maybe we can also look at some of the character traits that we can see in them, like bravery, There's things that maybe they're doing that aren't directly tied to the content, but we can be grateful for. So first, I want us to be grateful for kids. I think that's the most important thing. And then we're modeling that and they're seeing it. And then just like you said, Matt, there's practices. I love a gratitude circle. Tish Richmond was telling me about a really fun spin on it that she had done recently where it was teacher leaders and they sat one person in the middle of the circle and then not going around the circle, but popcorning. Okay, who has something nice to say for, we'll say Tish was in the middle of the circle. And then they would just take turns. And it was really fun to hear Tish talk about what it was like being in this circle, because she's like, people were saying things about me that I never thought people would acknowledge in me, that people would see in me, and they saw that value, and I didn't even know that. So there's a lot of really cool ways that we can bring gratitude into the classroom. I have one I've been doing really lately. Is this okay if I share another one?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really fun one, and I've done it with adults and with kids, but it's just give two, take two. Have you heard of this one? I just put a gratitude spin on it. So the way that I do it is I give everyone 2 Post-it notes and I say, hey, take a Post-it and I want you to write down something you're grateful to have learned, something that you're so happy that you now know. And I don't usually give a ton of constraints, but you could try and keep it more to the content that you're actually covering or something like that. But I usually leave it pretty wide open. So tell me something you're really grateful you know now, something you're grateful to have learned. Write it on one Post-it, then write it on the other Post-it, the exact same thing. So now you got 2 Post-its with the thing you're grateful for. Now we're going to get up and we're going to go find someone else in the room and we're going to exchange Post-its. And you're going to tell this person, here's what I learned and here's why I'm grateful I learned it. And then you'll do that to another person. So at the end, you walk away with 2 things that someone else thought was wisdom or at least important to know. And it kind of just fosters this feeling of, grateful to be learning, right? Because that sometimes we just take for granted in education. We're supposed to be learning, but maybe we won't always be grateful for the specific content of what we're learning, but I think we can always be grateful to be learning. I think that's something we want to foster.
No, I love that strategy. Take 2, get 2. And then, I just feel like that, there's so many different strategies, I think, that you can incorporate gratitude into a school. And I think that maybe there's been a paradigm shift over the last number of years. One of my buddies in the comments, Jacob Schultz, said this, positive psychology. And I think incorporating positive psychology in relation with, social emotional learning and I think gratitude practices are interwoven there. I think that really can, be, a game-changing piece for our students, given that currently in our schools and just in general, I think around the world and in North America, we have a mental health crisis with so many students, especially teenagers, are struggling significantly. So I think that if we can model a lot of this stuff beginning at the earliest of ages, it can go a long ways in terms of really incorporating, just overall, just higher emotional intelligence and hopefully overall higher aspects of well-being. So when you're thinking about gratitude practices and social emotional learning, do you talk a little bit about, interweaving it together, like I mentioned before? And what do you think you would suggest if you were coming into a school or district and saying like, hey, I really want, some gratitude practices. We can focus on building a school culture, maybe first or among the staff and then through in our classrooms. What would you recommend if we're starting from ground zero?
Yeah, well, if I could, I just want to interject a quote here because I thought this was one that I came across when I was researching. It's from Cicero. It says, gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others. If you were to look at gratitude and look at Castle and all the SEL competencies, gratitude is directly connected to all of them. If you are teaching gratitude, you are addressing the 5 SEL competencies. So I think that's pretty powerful. I will say also that you can overdo it with gratitude. Like if I'm a big fan of Castle's 3 signature practices: welcoming inclusion, activity, engaging strategies, and optimistic closure. So what I do is I try and make gratitude one of those. So maybe gratitude is going to be woven into my welcoming inclusion activity. For example, the give two, take two that I just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
that could be your welcoming inclusion activity. It takes 5 to 10 minutes, just something with that, bringing that gratitude for learning. And this is how we're kicking it off. You could also flip it and make it an optimistic closure if you really wanted to. But I just want to make sure that at some point we're bringing gratitude into the learning space. And so that's one way that I like to do that. Is I like to bring, I'm someone who, I do crave habits. I like habits because that's what keeps me on track. And so I like rituals and routines. And when I came across the 3 signature practices from Castle, I was like, done. I can do this. I can make sure there's always a welcoming inclusion activity. I always make sure there's engaging strategies, and I can always make sure there's an optimistic closure. And one of those for me is going to be about gratitude.
Oh, I love that. Just, those 3 activities, choose one and then make that a gratitude activity. That's because I feel like, there's going to be, if you do it too much, then the effect of being gracious will, it's like anything else in life, right? It's like if you do too much of it, right, it's going to not have that, positive effect anymore. So I think that's really, sound advice. And it's also great to know that it is the foundation of all those 5 Kessel SEL areas. I mean, that's huge, because then you can just if you want to focus on any of those areas, you can put that spin with gratitude in it. So I think that's huge. And I think, when people read your book and then listen to you talk about this, I mean, I think it really opens the doors, because I think it's like anything else. Like once the doors are open, it's actually something that we can do pretty easily. We just got to just start doing it and making a habit of it. So with that said, I feel like this school year, the 2021-22 school year, was, I think, one of the most challenging school years that we've ever faced in, I think, modern education. And now we're going into summer. By the time we're recording this, it's June 30th. We're going into July. What would you recommend to educators, regardless of their context right now? What's 1 or 2 things that you would give them in terms of advice for navigating the present and future?
Okay. Well, so if you don't mind, I do want to make a pitch for gratitude real quick before I get into the tips. So when I was researching for the book, I was like, okay, how am I going to sell this to people if they don't if they're not like leaning into gratitude for just intuitive reasons? Like, what am I going to be able to say? So the research, this is research, not anecdotal. This is research. Gratitude helps us cope with stress, regulate our emotions, makes us happier, improves our health, both physical and mental. It nurtures relationships, and it activates learning. So I feel like at least one of those should strike a nerve with everyone, and they should be like, okay, it sounds like being more intentional and consistent in practicing my gratitude is probably a good thing. And that would lead me to my first tip, which is I am a huge James Clear fan. One of my favorite quotes of his is having to do with consistency over intensity. And I would say the same thing with gratitude. You do not need to turn your life upside down to bring gratitude into your life. Pick a small practice. One of the most popular things, there's a ton of different practices in the book, like so many, I don't even want to list them, but one of the ones that's been really popular is creating a savoring ritual. Savoring walks would be a very cool thing that we could take kids on, where they're actually walking around and being really intentional with what's around them, really noticing the formation of the clouds, the weather, the wind. There's so many things around us every day that we just kind of take for granted. And so that could be a great way to get kids out of the classroom, a great brain break. That could be a pre-writing activity. It could be part of a science thing. So, but these are small things, right? It's just be consistent and don't worry about it being like this big elaborate situation. So that would be one of my tips, is consistency over intensity. And the other tip I would say is, one of my favorite $5 words is equifinality. Equal in the end is basically the way you could break that word down. We can all have a grateful disposition, but we don't all have to do the same things to get there. So the reason I'm super intentional in sharing a bunch of different practices in the book and then bringing Steph and the other 19 educators in with their voices is because there's a ton of different ways you could do this. So find the practice that's right for you, and don't be afraid to mix it up and try different ones until you find one that's a good fit for you.
No, I think those are all just really, fantastic, because really you hit on many different things that you can do. I personally, resonate with the consistency piece from James Clear. And I was reading Atomic Habits probably about 6 months ago, and I really liked a lot of what he was saying. And I think really, if you can do a lot of these acts, whether it's gratefulness, working on your mental health, going to the gym, eating right with consistency. I mean, you're going to obviously cheat because you're human, right? You want to do some vices and fun things once in a while that aren't necessarily going to be always consistent. But I mean, I feel like if you're up with that 80 to 90%, like that's pretty good. Like, I mean, even above 75%. And I think that if we continue to model that for our students, that's huge, because I mean, you're going to have success if you are doing things consistently versus trying to be, perfect 100% of the time. So I think that's really huge. And I like the perspectives of others, because I mean, there's so much diversity. And like I mentioned before, I think there's a lot of intersectionality to this. Is like, there's a lot of diversity, but it can all come together and we can all talk about it. And those experiences are really valuable because it may resonate with us, or it may let us see that in a different light. So
the stories from the contributors are so amazing. I mean, I really got just, and I know, because I'm holding this very wonderful book for the listeners. I am holding Matt's book. And you know how important it is to bring other voices in, because we are all so unique and dynamic. It's really, really helpful when we have those other voices. So very grateful to the contributors who just gave beautiful stories. And I'm really proud of this book. I hope it brings people as much joy as it's brought me.
Well, definitely. I mean, what I'm coming up is #better together, #healthier together. And Lainie, thank you so much for being on today. I truly do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a joy.
What's the best way that your followers or our listeners can get a hold of you and look up all of your great work?
I am pretty much Lainie Rowell across the web, although I'm much more active on Twitter and Insta than anywhere else. And if you get to either of those, I've got a link tree that's got a link to like my Edutopia articles, links to the books, and all that fun stuff. I do have a podcast now. So, another one, I should say. I have a podcast with Bree Hodges. We're in hiatus with Lemonade Learning, but in preparation and wanting to hear more voices about gratitude, I did start Evolving with Gratitude, the podcast. Maybe you'll join someday, Matt.
I know. Maybe I'll have to. I'm gonna definitely put that on my playlist and listen to a number of those episodes and definitely hear those perspectives. So I'm excited. So with that said, I really truly I think this is such an amazing topic, and something that in my own educational experience, and I think for many others, is that historically we haven't been talking about this. But at the end of the day, I think it's something that Lainie has talked about, is something that's really easy. And with I think a huge paradigm shift in terms of SEL and how gratitude is a foundation to those 5 major areas that a lot of us are focusing on, I truly think that it's something that is really doable. And I liked how she mentioned the strategy of using it essentially one time per lesson, with those 3 elements of like a positive welcome. There's like an activity in the middle, and then an optimistic ending. I think incorporating that into one of those is huge, because then you're modeling and then you're practicing it one way or another. And I think with a lot of things that we're doing, especially with student podcasts or journaling, I think there's just so many different ways and avenues you can go down with it. And there's a lot of connections that our students can make. So with that said, thank you everyone so much for joining in. We're at episode 49. I can't wait till we hit 50, and really do appreciate your time. So thank you everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your day today, and we'll talk soon. Have a good one. And thanks, Lainie, once again.